In the Middle Ages, nobody handed you a house. There were no banks to lend you money, no blueprints to follow, and no neat boxes of nails waiting at a store. If you wanted shelter, you had to make it yourself, from nothing, with your own hands. You built it on land you did not own, using tools your grandfather might have passed down, if you were fortunate enough to have them. Yet somehow, those homes lasted. They stood not just for a few seasons, but for generations. So how did people with almost nothing manage it? How did poor peasants, with little training and only their determination, build dwellings that could survive storms, wild animals, war, and the slow wear of time without using a single nail? This was more than just building. It was survival. It was about carving out warmth in a cold and unforgiving world. And it began not with tools or wood, but with the search for a place to belong. Today, finding a home means checking listings, signing contracts, and taking loans. Back then, it began with a far simpler, but much more dangerous question. Where can I build without being caught or punished? Because peasants did not own land. Nearly all of medieval Europe's soil, around 95% of it, belonged to someone else. It was controlled by lords, nobles, bishops, or the church. That meant most peasants were trespassers from the moment they were born. If they wanted a roof, they had three choices: ask for permission, take a gamble, or vanish into the forest. That last choice had its own name. It was called asserting, the forbidden act of clearing forest land to make room for crops and homes. You would chop down trees, burn stumps, clear brush, and hope the smoke did not draw attention. Because if the local lord saw it, he could fine you. Or worse. But sometimes, if you made the land useful, if you grew crops, raised animals, and paid what you owed, he might let you stay. You were, after all, improving his property. The clever peasants knew how to pick their ground wisely. They chose spots near the forest's edge, close enough for timber, but far enough to hide when trouble came. Some settled near small streams for washing, watering animals, and a rare bath. Others built on gentle hills so their floors would not flood after heavy rain. There were no zoning laws, but nature itself had strict rules. Does the ground stay dry after a storm? Are there trees to cut nearby? Is the soil soft enough to dig, but strong enough to hold a wall? These were not small details, but questions of survival. Many families wandered for days or even weeks before finding a patch of land that felt right. And still, there was no promise it would last. Archaeologists have found villages that did not just shrink or grow, but slowly shifted over time. Why? Because people rebuilt where the ground was better, the light warmer, the soil richer, or the danger less. Entire villages crept across the landscape without anyone calling it a move. Once a family chose their ground, they marked it with stakes or stones, a simple border, a quiet promise. Not to a lord or a law, but to themselves and the generations to come. But soil alone was not yet a home. It was just a start, a blank space waiting to be shaped. The real test was yet to come, building something strong enough to stand against wind, hunger, and the endless winter of the medieval world. If the soil was the skin of your medieval home, then wood was its bones. Nothing could stand without it. Every part of the house, from frame to roof, depended on timber. But wood was not free. It was not always allowed either. Most of the forests across medieval Europe belonged to nobles or the crown, guarded by strict forest laws. These laws decided exactly what could be taken and what could not. Picking up fallen sticks for the fire was usually fine. Cutting down a living oak, though, could cost you your hand or earn you a fine so steep your family would go hungry. Yet peasants still needed wood, and when the law would not bend, need did. So they learned to take what they could. They searched the forest floor for dry branches. They slipped into the trees at dawn, hatchets hidden beneath cloaks. They asked permission when they dared, and prayed for mercy when they did not. Their tools were few but precious. An axe, a mallet, a wedge of wood. The axe might be a treasured heirloom, passed down for generations. The mallet could be made from a knotted tree root, soaked in water so it not crack. Felling one tree could take a whole day. A small team of men hacking and resting, praying the trunk did not fall the wrong way. Then came the hardest part, getting it home. There were no carts, no engines. You did not call for help. You dragged the timber yourself, ropes over shoulders, poles used as rough sleds. In the rain, paths turned to mud, so many waited for the frost. Frozen ground made pulling easier, though sometimes the cold made ropes snap. Most timber came from within a mile or two of home. Anything farther invited danger. There were bandits, wild animals, even rival villages to fear. The forest was both a blessing and a boundary. Every kind of tree had a task. Oak made beams, strong and straight. Hazel was used for weaving, thin and bendable. Ash was for tools, willow for baskets. Nothing went to waste. Every stick had a role, and peasants learned to cut wood in winter. When the sap was low, the wood dried better and warped less. Logs were stacked and left for months to season naturally. It could take weeks to gather enough for a single cottage, a humble one-room house with a dirt floor, 4 sturdy walls, and a roof that promised shelter. Then came the challenge of turning those logs into a frame. There were no nails or screws, only skill and design. Wood joined with wood in the old way. The secret lay in the joints, mortise and tenon. Picture 2 puzzle pieces. One beam had a square hole, the mortise. The other had a carved tongue that fit neatly inside the tenon. Together they locked. No metal was needed, only pressure and precision. To keep it firm, builders used wooden pegs called tree nails or trunnels. These were hand-carved from dried oak or ash. When hammered in, they soaked up moisture and swelled, tightening the joints. Rain did not weaken the frame. It made it stronger. Raising the frame was never done alone. It took many people, men and women alike. Children brought water. Elders held the ladders. Neighbors worked side by side, lifting beams and setting posts. This was called a house raising, half hard labor, half celebration. If you ignored another family's house raising, you could not expect help when your own walls fell. In some places, that was an unwritten law. Help others or freeze alone. Each main post was buried at least 2 feet deep, sometimes more. The digging was done with wooden shovels, if fortune smiled, with iron spades. Some families placed stones beneath the posts to help with drainage, an ancient trick that went back to Roman times. When the posts stood firm, long beams were laid across their tops to hold the roof. Each one had to be raised by hand using ropes and poles. Accidents were common, and a single wrong move could be fatal. Still, they worked with patience and care. Slowly, the skeleton of the house rose, beam by beam, without nails or drawings, built on memory, trust, and the quiet strength of people who knew that true homes were not manufactured but made. They were built by communities. A frame could keep a house standing, but it still needed skin to live. For medieval homes, that skin was wattle and daub. Wattle was the weave, made of thin, bendable branches, often hazel or willow, woven between upright stakes. Picture it like weaving a giant basket, only this time the basket was a wall. Then came the daub. It was sticky, it was messy, and it was surprisingly effective. A mixture of clay, sand, straw, and animal manure. Yes, cow dung. It might sound unpleasant, but it worked beautifully. The manure acted as natural glue, filled with enzymes that made everything hold together. Everyone helped in the making. Adults shoveled, children stomped, and the mixing pit became a muddy playground. The daub was thrown onto the wattle by hand, layer by layer, pressed and smoothed on both sides. Some used wooden paddles, others used their bare hands. It was slow, careful work. Walls could take weeks to dry, and rain could undo an entire day's effort. But once dry, daub was strong, breathable, and warm. When coated with lime wash, a white chalky paint, the walls reflected sunlight and kept insects away. Inside, the walls were left rough, sometimes covered with cloth, sometimes bare. In winter, they grew cold to the touch. In summer, they cooled the house. And though the materials were humble, nothing but earth, straw, and dung, the result was a kind of rough poetry. Those walls, shaped from soil and sweat, stood through storms. They heard voices, laughter, and prayers, and they never asked for metal or wealth. A frame was the bones, the walls were the skin, but the roof protected the soul. In the medieval world, roofs were not made of tile or metal, or even planks of wood. They were made of thatch. Thatch was the perfect peasant material. It was free, light, and close at hand. Made from bundles of straw, reeds, or grass, thatch was laid thick like an animal's fur, guarding what lay below. But this was no simple job. Thatching required skill and patience. Done poorly, it leaked, decayed, or burned. Done well, it could last for half a century. Building a thatched roof began with collecting the right plants. Peasants gathered wheat straw from the fields and reeds from the marshes. These were dried, bundled, and sorted carefully. The bundles were laid from bottom to top, each layer overlapping the next, just like feathers or scales, guiding rain away from the house. To secure them, peasants used split hazel rods known as sways. Bent and fastened, they held the thatch tightly against the wooden rafters. No nails were used, only rope, wood, and the right amount of pressure. The slope of the roof was vital. Too shallow, and rain would seep through. Too steep, and the thatcher could fall. It was dangerous work. One wrong step could mean a broken limb, and in those days, that could mean death. That is why most medieval roofs stood at about 45 to 60 degrees, the safest and strongest angle. A good roof kept the wind out, the heat in, and softened the noise of the outside world. Still, it had flaws. Birds made nests inside it, mice chewed through it, and sometimes snakes found shelter beneath it. The roof was a living world of its own. Fire was the greatest danger. A single spark from the hearth could set the entire home ablaze. Some towns eventually banned thatch, but for peasants, there was no real alternative. So they accepted the risk. They patched their roofs often and hoped for safety. They taught their children to fear fire and to respect it. When the walls were dry and the roof secure, the house was complete, at least in name. But finished meant something different then. Inside, it was small and plain. Usually a single room, about 15 by 20 feet. A dirt floor, smoke in the rafters, and a corner shared with livestock. The floor was not just soil, but packed earth, mixed with straw and lime, sloped slightly to let waste and water drain away. To mask the damp smell, some families spread sweet herbs like mint or meadowsweet. Furniture was simple. A rough bench by the wall, a plank table resting on barrels, a stool or two. Beds were little more than raised wooden frames filled with straw, shared by parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes a goat for warmth. Heat was survival, and space was precious. Tools and food were hung from rafters to stay dry. It was humble, crowded, and smoky, but it was home. Hooks held tools, pegs held clothing. Broken pots stored grains. Baskets kept onions, dried herbs, and that one precious treasure, salt. Privacy did not exist. There were no separate rooms, no inner doors. The entire family, often 6 to 10 people, lived, ate, and slept together in a space smaller than a modern garage. Light came from a hole in the roof or from small shuttered openings covered with oilcloth or parchment. Glass windows were a luxury few could dream of. So the house stayed dim, always dim, but never lifeless. It breathed with warmth, scent, and sound. It was the place where children were born, where people sang softly while they worked, where stories were told beside the glow of the fire, and where death came quietly among the faces that had always been there. At the heart of every home burned a fire. It was not enclosed or guided by pipes, only an open hearth, a circle of stones, sometimes raised, sometimes carved straight into the earth. There were no chimneys. Smoke drifted upward on its own, seeping through the thatch, the cracks, and the spaces between beams. The air inside was always smoky. The rafters turned black, and children's eyes watered often. Yet that smoke was life itself. The fire cooked the food, heated the water, dried wet clothes, and warmed cold bodies. It was light, warmth, heart, and hazard all in one. Meals were cooked in pots hung above the flame or buried under ashes. Stews, porridge, and simple bread were common fare. Each person had a knife and their fingers. Trenchers of hard bread served as plates. Spoons were rare. Meals were simple, shared, and hot. Finding fuel was a daily battle. People burned wood, dried dung, or peat. In coastal places, even seaweed was used. Gathering took hours, but it had to be done. Without fire, there was no heat, no food, and soon no life. The hearth had no guardrails. Children were scolded, pulled back, or struck for wandering too near, but burns still happened. A single step too close in the dark could mean days of pain. Still, no one cursed the fire. It was a gift, and gifts demanded respect. Some communities formed small traditions around it. Neighbors shared glowing coals. Families saved embers overnight in clay pots. The hearth was sacred, not as part of worship, but because it was the heart of survival. It held the home together, not only in structure, but in meaning. Without it, there would be no comfort, no meals, no life worth living. Building a house was hard, but keeping it alive was harder. For peasants, repair was not an option, but a way of life. Rain cracked the walls, wind tore at the roof, frost split the beams, and rodents gnawed at everything they could reach. There were no rest days, no helpers to hire, no promises of insurance. You fixed what broke, or you froze. Each season brought its own work. Spring meant mending the roof. Summer meant adding fresh daub. Autumn was for strengthening posts before the winds returned. Winter was for waiting and hoping. Walls were painted with lime wash each year, not just to look clean, but to spot leaks early. When white patches turned brown, water had found a way in. Act quickly, or decay would follow. Floors were filled and packed again with dirt. Sweet herbs were scattered to fight damp smells. Firewood was stacked daily. Children learned to help and to remember, because no one wrote instructions. The rule was simple. Ask the elders before they were gone. Every few decades, the house might be torn down and rebuilt in the same place, with a new frame, but the same family. Through storms, sickness, and war, the homes endured. Not because they were flawless, but because someone always cared enough to repair them. That was their real power. A medieval cottage was not beautiful by modern standards. It was not roomy, private, or spotless. It came without locks, without keys, and without promises. But it was warm. It was alive. It was stage, chapel, bedroom, barn, kitchen, and cradle all in one. Its walls were shaped from soil and straw, but its foundation was made of memory, work, and quiet endurance. No printed plans, no machines, no nails, only hands, only people, only life. We may not wish to live in those houses again, but we can still remember what held them steady. It was not just timber or clay. It was care, and care never fades.